Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my session today. Today, I am going to be talking about my undergraduate dissertation, which was in English literature and was supervised by Caroline Gonder, whose session you might well have just come from. This is my first ever talk like this, so if things go wrong or seem rushed, please just forgive me. I'd love any feedback that you have. So if you want to write any questions or anything in the chat, we will hopefully come back to it at the end. I've tried my best to condense this down. So hopefully everything will make sense. The title of this session and of my dissertation is Anne Lister's queer metaphor, You Could Make Anything of Me. And this subtitle, You Could Make Anything of Me, is something that Miss Brown, one of Lister's romantic interests, said to her. And hopefully it'll make sense why I use this when we come back to it later. So this dissertation project essentially started with this question, et fou Achilles. And I don't speak French, so forgive the pronunciation, but et fou Achilles, are you Achilles? Lister wrote about this question in her journal records about her Paris trip to Paris in 1824. The question et fou Achilles underlined in the slide. This question was asked of Lister by Miss Mackenzie during this stay in Paris. She stayed with Miss Mackenzie and this group of English women while she was in Paris. And what is really interesting about this group of women is that they exchanged questions and quotations, like literary quotations, with each other. And that was a huge part of how they interacted with each other. So this question, et fou Achilles, is part of this sort of larger framework of these women interacting with each other, getting to know each other. But I think it's also a lot more intimate than that. So Miss Mackenzie actually writes this question down rather than asking Lister verbally. She also writes it down in French rather than in English, and both of these women were English. So I think it's something much more secretive and much more sort of hidden, and therefore is probably not part of this larger interaction. It's probing at something to do with Lister's queerness, her gender nonconformity, that sort of thing. Question for Achilles, or the character Achilles, is really interesting with regards to gender nonconformity, sexuality, and Chris Ralston has written a lot about that, but that's not necessarily what interests me about this question. If you couldn't guess, I'm interested in the metaphor. So the metaphor is, are you Achilles, rather than a simile, are you like Achilles, which would be et vous comme Achilles. So like I say, I think this question is asking about Lister's queerness, and it's using metaphor as this way of asking about queerness. So this question and this metaphor allows these women to sort of understand each other and interpret each other's relationship to queerness. Not that I necessarily think that Miss Mackenzie was queer or that it's possible to know whether she was queer or not, but it does show that she had this sort of familiarity and receptiveness to queerness and was able to pick it up in Lister. And basically, I argue that this is a distinctly queer type of metaphor used by queer people, about queer people in queer writing, and that Lister's extensive journals are a uniquely prolonged example of this way of using metaphor. Essentially, this type of metaphor holds Lister, are you Achilles, and Achilles in the same viewpoint. It's not one replacing the other, it's both. And that is important. I'm now going to talk about the history of metaphor very briefly. It might be slightly boring, but it should help things make sense, hopefully. So thanks to the work of Stephen Turton, who we saw earlier in the summit, we know that Lister made use of this dictionary, which is Nathan Bailey's Universal Etymological English Dictionary, to produce a sexual vocabulary or glossary. So I know I was interested in metaphor. This was my first port of call to think about what metaphor might have meant to Lister. And Bailey defines metaphor as a trope in rhetoric by which we put a strange and remote word for a proper one by reason of its resemblance to the thing of which we speak. And I'm not trying to say that Lister definitely looked up this definition of metaphor in this dictionary, but I think it's a useful starting point. And I think this definition is really interesting with regards to strangeness and properness, because strange and queer are and were sort of synonyms, and the idea of being proper or propriety is very much in line with heterosexual standards of behavior and that sort of thing. So essentially, this metaphor is playing with taking something heterosexual and viewing it with a queer lens. I think Lister would be primed to pick up on this implication if she did read it, because obviously she was queer and was able to pick up of the queer implications of Miss Mackenzie's question through Achilles. So this definition is part of a wider theory of metaphor, which stems right back to the ancient Greeks who wrote about Achilles originally. Paul Ricoeur wrote this absolute behemoth of a text called The Rule of Metaphor, and he wrote about the classical metaphor and defines it as a deviation in relation to the standard meaning of words. And so what interests me about this is it's a single deviation in relation to standard meaning of words. If we go back to Bailey, Bailey talks about a remote word for a proper one. So the conventional model of metaphor is essentially one word or one thing being metaphorized and changed. This guy, Henry, I have a vague memory of this being pronounced Hume, so I'm just going to go with it. Henry Hume wrote Elements of Criticism, which was published in 1762. And this is a book that's basically about different literary techniques, like simile, like metaphor. This was published in 1762, and I don't think Lister necessarily has read it, and it's certainly not on the Pact with the Potential book spreadsheet. But this text does represent what people would have thought about metaphor around the time of Lister. And Hume describes metaphor as an act of the imagination figuring just one thing to be another. And so this is different from what I've identified as the queer metaphor, because the queer metaphor is about more than just one thing. It's about both things being viewed at the same time. It's about a sort of double vision rather than one thing replacing another or being figured as another, which is different from the sort of conventional ideas of metaphor. What is also interesting, or what I think is interesting, is Are You Achilles also involves an element of characterization. By this time in history, Achilles was very much a mythological figure rather than being considered a person that actually exists. So there's an element of characterization and sort of changing that allows this double vision to take place. And this double vision allows for queerness to be interpreted. It doesn't replace the heterosexual with the queer, it expands from heterosexuality into queerness. It doesn't replace it, it sort of holds us both rather than either or. I think, though I haven't worked it out, I think this might somehow relate to what we now call the gaydar, but yeah, I'm not sure yet. So check back in with me, maybe. Michel Foucault writes in his History of Sexuality that the anguish of answering questions and the delight of having one's words interpreted is, in short, the formidable pleasure of analysis. And I think that the queer metaphor is a pleasurable way of analysing and of revealing and expanding meaning, which is perhaps why it was used so extensively in Lister's journals and perhaps by the people around her, because it is enjoyable and it sort of opens the potential of queerness to the people in her society and the people around her. So the example that I make of Lister's own use of queer metaphor is with Miss Maria Brown, or she called her in the journals Kalista. Very briefly, Miss Brown is a young woman who moved into Halifax in 1818, and Lister basically develops a crush on her. Miss Brown and Lister bond over many forms of the written word. They meet in the library very often. The route to the post office essentially goes past Miss Brown's house, so Lister writes loads of letters and uses it as an excuse to run in with her. But one of the most important ways that they connect is through poetry. And an early conversation between them, Lister asks Miss Brown whether she likes Byron's poetry, and Miss Brown responds with, yes, perhaps too well, which is underlined in a slightly bolder yellow line. By 1818, which is when this interaction took place, Byron had been accused of sodomy and voluntarily exiled himself from Britain. And it's likely, because there was a big scandal about it, that Lister and Miss Brown were both aware of the potential queerness of the writer and of his poetry. So this admission, I like Byron too well, seems to sort of be poised on the edge of a queer admission. And this perhaps too well is a phrase that Lister returns to again and again, almost like she's analysing Miss Brown's words in the way that an academic might analyze the words of a literary character. She even encloses the line in quotation marks, as you can see, and Lister's use of punctuation is scarce. So this is something that really does sort of attract the eye, and I don't think that Lister's punctuation is something that's been sort of thought about much. And I think that it should, because I think it's perhaps an extra level of indexing and attracting attention. But anyway, Lister is sort of almost obsessive over this, perhaps too well. She keeps writing about it. I think she writes about it another 3 times over 3 different days. So there's sort of this impulse of literary criticism, I think, being practiced upon Miss Brown, which is sort of compounded by the nickname Kalista, as I shall call her. In January 1818, Lister records this line in her journal for the first time. Kalista seems to be a nickname derived from the Greek mythological nymph Callisto, who was just renowned for her beauty. But importantly, she is a character, just like Achilles is a character. So Lister combines the real person of Miss Brown and Callisto into the journal character Kalista. So the queer metaphor is back and is viewing them both at the same time. On the 27th of June, 1818, Lister recalls seeing Miss Brown and records that she was in a white gown and green velvet spencer, looked Kalista. So I've looked, Kalista is underlined on the slide again. And this is very obviously a metaphor. She looked Kalista. She didn't look like Kalista. Obviously, this could be a space-saving thing, but I think that, we're thinking about queer metaphor. I think that is convincingly a metaphor. What I think is also quite interesting about this specific passage is the abbreviation for looked Kalista. The D of looked is superscripted, which means that it's smaller and like slightly above the line. I've zoomed in there, and I think it also looks like an exclamation mark. Hopefully me typing it has made that clear. And I think that this sort of small section or small tiny 2 words does have a sort of something to say about queer metaphor, in that it is both the superscripted looked ed and the exclamation mark. Like it's both. And again, part of this sort of indexing, I've lost my words, indexing, punctuation, interest, that kind of thing. I have lost my place. I knew this was going to happen. It's going to be on. So I essentially think that Lister treats her women like text. Stephen Colclough has written that Lister effectively wrote her own version of the texts that she borrowed from the Halifax libraries, and she used these rather than the texts themselves. And I think that Lister essentially treats the women in her life as text. She writes her own version, she consults them, and she uses this version to interpret their queerness, which in turn affects reality. And I think that this gives her a certain power over women that is like the power of an author over a character. And it is this queer metaphor and this double-visioned interpreted stance that allows her the power of the author. Miss Brown even says to Lister, "You could make anything of me," which is the subtitle. And I was talking before about how the queer metaphor expands meaning rather than replaces it. And I think this idea of "you could make anything of me," not just something of me, but anything of me, is this really sort of expansive effect of queer metaphor. Kalista isn't the only nickname that Lister used in her journals. She also gave Isabella Norcliffe the nickname Tib, and this is a sort of slight tangent, but I think it's an exciting one. As far as I know, no one has written about this or sort of found it before I have, but there is actually an entry for Tib in Nathan Bailey's dictionary. Again, it's probably unlikely that Lister, or we can't know whether Lister looked up this definition of Tib and decided to use it for Isabella, but it's there. And so Bailey defines Tib as a poor, sorry woman. And I think this really typifies Lister's view of Tib. She definitely didn't envisage having a prolonged romantic relationship with her, inviting her to live at Shibden because she was an alcoholic, amongst other things. So I think this is sort of really typifies Lister's perception of Tib. But what is really interesting is Nathan Bailey's definition of queer. So he defines queer as odd, fantastical, and sorry. And what does Tib mean? A poor, sorry woman. So obviously can't know for certain, but Lister calls Miss Brown Kalista after Callisto, the most beautiful nymph to exist. She calls Tib a queer woman. I love it. But again, this is part of, she creates the character Tib in her journals, and this affects how she interacts with Tib in real life, essentially. So I hope I've made it clear that the queer metaphor is quite different from the sort of average metaphor, in that it is sort of holding both things at the same time. It expands upon the meaning of the thing rather than replacing it one over the other. And it is ultimately something that allows Lister, or Miss Mackenzie in the case of Achilles, to interpret the queerness of each other, or of Miss Brown in the Lister and Miss Brown case. I think that not only is queer metaphor bigger than the single word that other critics have talked about, I think it's also goes down to the letter and is much smaller than that, or can be much smaller than that. And I think Lister's crypt-hand can be understood as queer metaphor, as I hope will make sense. One of Lister's lifelong lovers is Mariana Lawton, the Belcom, who she refers to as M in the uncoded sections of her journal. But this isn't the only way she refers to Mariana. On the 25th of July, 1818, she writes, "As usual, no breathings of affection in the letter. The letter is from Mariana. We both write what anybody might write to anybody, and if Pi is like me," then there's the rest of the quote. What is important is this Greek letter Pi. It's a Greek letter that she uses to refer to Mariana in the encoded sections. Lister's crypt-hand code uses Greek letters like outside of this. Lister also refers to Mariana's husband, Charles Lawton, with Delta, and she refers to Miss Brown with theta. And I just think that's really strange. Lister's crypt-hand uses mathematical symbols and Greek symbols. And this crypt-hand is a letter for letter substitution. So, like, one letter equals A, one letter equals B. But this is a sort of code within a code, where a sort of a single letter stands for a whole name. As we can see, theta stands for Miss Brown. And I think this relates to queer metaphor in the sense that the single sign, which is a way of saying letter, the single sign refers to an entire name. So you're seeing the single letter and the name sort of at the same time. And paper was quite expensive back when Lister was writing. So in condensing these names into a single letter, Lister essentially saves space and allows her more space to write and analyze sort of what these people are doing, how she's reacting to them, that sort of thing. I keep talking about the double vision needed for queer metaphor to sort of expand meaning and to allow for interpretation. I think that her entire crypt-hand, as well as the letters that she uses to refer to, names, basically enacts queer metaphor and the double vision of queer metaphor and allows her to practice this double vision, this queer double vision, in her reading and writing practices. I think it's really interesting that with the sort of letters that stand for a name, she is encoding as she is decoding. So she encodes the letters delta, theta, pi, and uses this act of encoding and this sort of queer metaphor to decode her lovers. The single sign is simultaneously understood as the figure, as delta, but also the meaning that Lister gives it in her crypt-hand code, much as, like I say, it's single letter for letter substitution. So upon the page, it is both the encryption and the English word that she is spelling. So I think that the code sort of embodies queer metaphor, and I hope that makes sense, and I hope you can see why I think that. I'm going to come back briefly to the pleasure of the queer metaphor. So this is a quote from Anira Rowanchild, and I don't think I have time to read it really. But I think it's important for thinking about the pleasure that the code as queer metaphor can provide, not only in the sense that her lovers were given the key to the code and had the pleasure of decoding and sort of interpreting Lister from the code itself, but also the pleasure that we have as modern readers, because Anira Rowanchild, this quote is talking about the text or the way of reading the text as an outsider, as someone who doesn't necessarily know the code but then breaks it. And I think that queer metaphor is so large within Lister's work and so pleasurable that we can derive pleasure from it and from breaking the code as queer metaphor. And that essentially queer metaphor is perhaps something much larger, but I haven't written about it yet. So that was really quite rushed. So thank you. It's a surface level overview of what I've written about. I hope it all made sense. There is time for questions. If you have any, and if you don't, or if it didn't make sense, feedback is good. Doesn't matter positive or negative. And my information is there if you want to reach out, if you have questions that I haven't answered, that kind of thing. And yeah, just thank you for listening. I'm not sure whether I look through the chat. Let's see. Other places. So one question, can you think of other places where this kind of queer metaphor might be used in writing by women? I've been looking at the corpus of Anna Seward recently, and I think that she has some really interesting metaphors with regards to her sort of lifelong love interest, Honora, and sort of there's this line about nature writing beauty upon her face. And I think definitely Anna Seward, but I haven't. This was sort of the product of a few months in my final year where I was also revising for 3 exams. So it is very focused on Lister, but I haven't expanded it yet. I am now doing a master's degree, so hopefully I can think about it more broadly, but at the moment, not yet. Can you think of other places where queer metaphor might be used? Okay, that was. Do you think that these queer metaphors could possibly be a way for Lisa to talk about the women that she liked and loved discreetly without the use of code? I think that the queer metaphor does largely take place through code from what I've read. Obviously, I've only really looked at 1818 to 1820, and then this moment in Paris in 1824. And that was largely through convenience because Helena Whitbread published about the 1818s in the first volume of The Secret Diaries of Miss Anne Lister. So I haven't really looked wider yet because, like I say, I was doing many other things whilst also writing this. So I'm sure that there are other lovers that she wrote about. I just haven't looked at it yet. But yeah, I think it is an element of discretion. Like the Achilles question wasn't written in English, it was written in French. So I think it is definitely a more discreet way of thinking about these women, or a more indirect way to think about these women. And then another question is, were there other people using classical metaphors in relation to their sexuality at this time? And the honest answer is, I don't really know. I am an undergraduate, or I was an undergraduate. I'm 2 weeks into my master's, so I don't really know, and I'm not that familiar with the classics. There is Helena Whitbread's editions do write about this or mention this. There is the sixth satire of this Roman poet Juvenal, who had this quite famous or remarkable episode where he talks about women performing sexual acts with other women. I can't remember, and I don't think I know exactly how broad knowledge and sort of interest in that was, but Lister certainly did use it as a sort of test to see if the people around her were receptive to queerness. Do you have a favorite queer metaphor you've come across outside the ones you've shared here? I don't. I really like the ones I've written about. I think that, you know, having doing a dissertation, you kind of got to do stuff you're interested in. There is an episode with Veer Hobart where Lister says, "I am an Icarus." But like I say, I sort of wanted to skew or err away from the classics because it's just not something that I'm that familiar with. I wanted to talk about metaphor rather than classical metaphors or classical characters in metaphor. Okay, yeah, that is it. Yeah, cool. And I think that's all the questions for now. And it is about time to end. So if you have anything else to say, you have my contact information. And yeah, thank you so much.